So while I was perusing some history in regards to the Occupy movement and its relationship with Antifa and Black Bloc, I came across this video, and it kind of cemented what I had already understood to be the case, that it was strange to me. It seems as though people have forgotten that there was a time period when those of us in the various Occupy Wall Street chapters found ourselves at odds with the violent tactics that Antifa slash Black Bloc were employing. There's a lot of amnesia going on right now in the leftist movements in general about this, so it was kind of vindicating to stumble on this video.
Peaceful protests by the Occupy Oakland movement were overshadowed this week by violent clashes between a small group of demonstrators and the police. Now there is concern among the majority of the protesters that their message is being hijacked. We asked John Blackstone to look into this.
It could be seen as a battle for the image of the Occupy movement. One demonstrator struggles to put out the flames of a burning barricade as others, masked and dressed in black, pull him away. It wasn't the only time during a huge Occupy demonstration in Oakland this week that protesters found themselves on opposite sides. When dozens of black-clad marchers began attacking a supermarket, others urged them to stop, finally linking arms to protect the store from further destruction. One demonstrator, Sheikh Anderson, distanced most of the protesters from the violence.
We called the mayor's office the moment we understood what was going on over there. That was an anonymous action. That was nothing to do with Occupy Oakland.
Our streets! Our streets! For many demonstrators, a sinister mask fashioned on Guy Fawkes, the revolutionary who attempted to blow up the British Parliament buildings more than 400 years ago, has become a worldwide symbol of anarchy and revolution. For years, black-clad demonstrators known as the Black Bloc have been showing up at marches in Europe and the U.S. Although often small in numbers, by destroying property and challenging police, they can hijack the message of otherwise peaceful protests.
I see Black Bloc as a tactic, not really as a movement.
Ryan Andriola, an Occupy demonstrator, says he believes in nonviolence, but is not ready to condemn the tactics of the Black Bloc.
As individuals, we respect people's freedom to act the way that they feel they have to act to make the changes they wish to see.
Those intent on violence may be on the fringes, but once trouble begins, they often get the spotlight. In Oakland, city officials have warned that more violence could bring another order to close down the Occupy encampment. John Blackstone, CBS News, San Francisco.
So that was a little history lesson in what used to be the relationship between the Occupy movement and the Antifa slash Black Bloc movement. They referred to the Black Bloc tactic, and that's basically just what you see today. In fact, like, if you go back and look at it, if I had shown you that video and not told you what the time frame was, you would have assumed it was just a current activist protest issue. When we were in Occupy Detroit, these people would show up behind our peaceful marches and destroy stuff, and generally we would get the blame for it, which is what you saw the Occupy guy from Oakland trying to point out, this wasn't us, this is, we don't advocate for this. And anyway, this led me to going back to some of my Facebook groups for what was, basically left of Occupy Detroit and Occupy Flint, to ask some questions of people, and the conversation that came about was kind of disturbing. So I posted the link here to that same video that we just watched, and some of these people here were involved in Occupy a lot longer ago. So for example, that video I just showed you is from like 2011, I think. But here we have: many Black Bloc used to have another name and was a thorn in the side of the newspaper strikers, then became BAM. BAM is by any means necessary. Who were a problem with the school gentrification and eviction defense. They refused to work with other organizations, but not all of them. The person laughing here is I guess now former member of BAM, who's also kind of an extremist on the racial activism scale. And he also laughs at me down here when I point out, I guess what bothers me is we used to understand that violence and looting were counterproductive to activism and to our image. And now if you suggest that, you get called a bootlicker. Meanwhile, public support for BLM and our leftist movements is generally plummeting. So just to back that up, I'll actually kind of go down here for a moment and show a graph that demonstrates that. But the support for Black Lives Matter has been shrinking since June, around the time the riots came about. And as you can see, we got favorable in the yellow, unfavorable in the blue, and the yellow is coming down slowly. And then the right side, the blue is steadily going up. And this is a trend that I see in a lot of different polls, that basically the Black Lives Matter movement is losing more and more support as time goes on, and there's good reasons for that. But anyway, going back to this original conversation, because it kind of goes into what I was suggesting earlier, that there are a lot of people who say, well, nobody's really saying that stuff, like they don't understand what's going on, but anyway, I'm going to actually bring this video up later because it's relevant to my domestic terrorism comments that I'm going to bring up. But basically, this is the video I'm sure some of you have seen of Black Lives Matter showing up at a cafe and harassing and terrorizing diners. This comment here is from somebody who's upset that I shared that and said that I need to look into whoever runs the channel, and that it's probably just mainstream media. And this tendency to just kind of dismiss sources because you don't like what the sources are revealing is a little ridiculous, particularly since they'll do that even if it's just raw footage of something that proves a point, as if like the mainstream media is like deep faking people. But anyway, this is the point that I'd say is the most telling. Okay, whether or not violence occurred, any violence committed at one of these protests or by anti-fascists writ large isn't violence, it's self-defense. And I said, the video above is clearly terrorism. They storm into a cafe and throw chairs and knock over people's food and drink. While BLM may not claim as a whole to be engaged in terrorism, there are in fact elements who are, and that is factual. Anyway, Logan says, black people murdered by police daily have a right to self-defense. Protesters brutalized by said police also have that right. We all have the right to tell our police in no uncertain terms to stop killing us, not even mentioning the economic violence done by the owner class, causing starvation and poverty. We not only have the right, but the obligation to defend ourselves from institutional forces trying to kill us. And then I said, it's self-defense when you are literally being attacked at that moment. No other time is it self-defense. And then I said, looting and destruction of businesses is also not self-defense. And he said, it absolutely is. What self-defense is an unarmed man, or unarmed black man, able to practice against an armed cop? Self-defense is practiced against the society which causes this to happen with no recourse. Capitalism kills through poverty, so capitalism must go, hence the looting. Also, looting isn't real violence when those goods have been kept from a terminally disadvantaged economic class. So I say, just so we are clear, you are suggesting that all looting, destruction of property, and violence that goes on at protests is self-defense, even if at that particular moment nobody has initiated physical violence against you. It's all self-defense? And he said, what else is someone supposed to do when the police and our economy are ethnically cleansing people of color and the poor? And I said, so what you are suggesting then is that these protests turn riots are actually militant action to destroy the capitalist system itself and the government? And then he says, organically, yes, not like it's planned. People are reaching to the system, or reacting to the system killing them. Shit, I wish they were planned. And I said, well, some of them are absolutely planned. My concern is that we are being duped into tactics and ideology that will not only turn the public against us, it will allow the government to gain the public support of the Patriot Act and its provisions for domestic terrorism. And he says, if the public is against us, that is our fault, and it really doesn't matter. Deposing billionaires and their pocketed politicians by any means necessary is frankly our only means for long-term human survival and reducing the burden on the marginalized. So this is what I said back to him, and I've said this on my show before, but I said this is not a winnable battle using the strategies you are suggesting. The government has not even started the water cannons, use of dogs, and proactive use of batons yet. The microwave cannons and sonic weapons are only just starting to be suggested, and that technology was perfected years ago, and that is just the non-lethal. If you wanted an armed insurrection, blood in the streets, etc., then you escalate the issue out of public opinion in hearts and minds and into a military conflict that is totally unwinnable, and that is by design. If you were going to effect an overthrow of the system, you would need the support of a significant portion of the police and military behind you, two groups that activists have been encouraged to alienate for years. And he said, I don't disagree with you, which is why I see our current situation as completely unwinnable. Unfortunately, that leads me to a try or die either way scenario. To me, this is also a question of obligation. I can't in good conscience sit idle while my friends and neighbors die preventably. So, the girl I was talking to in the conversation says, which is the best reason to join in the struggle. Imagine working together in the left for the best possible outcome. I am 100% behind the BLM movement. I would like it to win. This person, Barbara, basically advocates nonviolent activism like I do. And then Logan says, I don't disagree with this either. I just think the best possible outcome is to roll these nonviolent movements, which serve their purpose for now, into something actually revolutionary. Trust me, I don't like this any more than anyone else. It just appears to be the last of our options. And then I said, I strongly feel that there are people manipulating us into believing that and luring us into a trap. We were making real headway ideologically. The democratic socialist movement was making real progress. Bernie, for example. But if you allow us to be radicalized to the degree you are suggesting, we will literally destroy that. We will go back to being compared to Stalin and the, USSR instead of Denmark. And anyway, he says, I suppose my problem is, 1, I don't believe democratic socialism will take in the U.S. before it is too late, and 2, I don't believe the Democratic Party as it exists will ever be a route to socialism, and 3, the Democrats are going to lose this election. So I suggested this video to him, which, by the way, is brilliant, and I'm going to go ahead and play it now. And the only thing that, as I play this, is that this is a funny video, but it has a very serious message. So don't allow yourself to be totally swallowed up by that. But here it goes.
We are here in protest!
We are also here in protest.
What do you think you're doing?
Exercising our First Amendment right. What are you doing?
Standing up for what's right.
Bullshit.
Black Lives Matter.
All lives matter.
Abolish the police.
Support our boys in blue.
Wear masks, stay inside.
Coronavirus is a hoax, folks.
Racists, communists,
Fascists.
Snowflakes.
React with pure emotion.
Facts don't care about your feelings, unless they're my feelings.
Violence is okay if you're mad enough.
Finally, I can practice self-defense.
America!
This is fucking great. I couldn't have done it without you.
Anytime, man. Fucking idiots.
So,
We are here in protest.
sorry, it started on me again. I'll link that video down below, but this guy, Brandon Kilvillo, holy crap, he totally nailed it with that video. But the big part that's important at the end that I think people tend to overlook is the part where you see the government and the media talking to each other about how they brought this about. So anyway, going back to the conversation, now here's the backlash that I get for sharing that video, but it kind of brings up, brings into focus rather the level of polarization I'm talking about, because the two sides of this argument literally have been polarized against each other so much to the point that they don't even think of each other as human. So Logan says, viewing these two as even remotely the same as a joke. One group is fascists that want police impunity to kill black people and billionaires in power. One wants the marginalized to survive regardless of race or economic status. If you're not on the side of justice, get out. I asked him, did you watch the entire video? He said, yes, fascists don't get First Amendment rights or rights to self-defense. The point stands. And I brought up, did you watch the part at the end where the government is high-fiving the media? The point of this video is to illustrate two sides being manipulated and radicalized against each other as part of the government's plan. In the end, MAGA and Antifa will be sitting in the same concentration camps, dreaming of better days. And, but to kind of bring back to what I was suggesting here, this is how far we've gone. This person basically has openly said that we should go ahead and just engage in tearing down the system, because, he acknowledges that it's extremely unlikely that that will work, but he's basically been pushed by, desperation, and I would say kind of an overinflated idea of how bad things really are. And on the other side of that, the right has the same attitude about things. That things are just being pushed so darn far, and that's why everybody's getting into the streets and fighting each other exactly as the elites want us to. I do hammer on the left a lot lately, but that's largely because of the fact that I'm on the left. I feel responsible for trying to take some kind of a part in improving the situation. And to some people, any kind of deviation or even suggesting that we might be doing something wrong means that I'm actually the opposite. I'm evil. And that's why I compare it all the time to like an inquisition with witch hunts and purity tests and blasphemers and heretics, But anyway, so he just openly stated, that, it's time for violence and nothing else works, and I think that, towards the end of the conversation, it ended very civil, and I got to give this guy credit for being civil the whole way. He didn't come after me in the conversation, but commonly that is the case, and somebody else does come after me in the conversation later. It's the guy formerly of BAM I was talking about, and of course I needed to get called a racist again. We're getting to the point now where calling people racist is losing any value or meaning, and I just don't care. I'm not going to let these people in any way define for me what my relationship with the people of color in my life are, based on some stupid political argument. But anyway, so this conversation is an example of what I'm talking about, in that people are basically being suggested that acts of violence, looting, arson, that it's all self-defense, that we've essentially convinced ourselves that even if nobody at the moment is doing something to us initiating violence against them is an act of self-defense. Now, this person here said, Bill Caspo, Black Bloc is a tactic. Being Antifa is a moral stance. But the cadres that started organizing Occupy Wall Street in mid-July of 2011 were about 100% anarchist Antifa who were fine with Black Bloc tactics. So another thing that I, keep having to remind people of is that Antifa was largely anarchist and largely communist. I'll get into another video later about that. And again, I don't even oppose anarchism or communism, as in like I don't hate people who hold those ideologies. That's not what it's about. It's that there's currently kind of an effort going on right now to just forget this history that existed as far as to what Antifa and was and what it represented. People don't even remember what the colors of the flags mean. And I do, because I studied different anarchist schools, just out of curiosity. But people nowadays have literally no idea what they're getting involved in. And I'm going to be doing a separate video specifically about Antifa and its relationship to communism. But anyway, so, Barbara says the biggest problem is you cannot make a plan because they will show up and do whatever they want. Demos work best when everyone is on board. Impossible with these guys. And, I said, that's what I remember as well. We would have peaceful marches and they would show up and break stuff and we would get the blame. So, and again, it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, about it's not just about the morality or lack of morality when it comes to looting and burning. It's that activism is a public relations effort. You're trying to change people's hearts and minds. with terrorism and all that, you can get people to be quiet. You can get them to be publicly compliant, but it doesn't actually change their minds. And if you make them afraid, you actually get the opposite effect. You get people doubling down on their beliefs, and more to the point, you get them to be more and more peaceful with or not peaceful, supportive of the idea of people taking harsh actions against you. So that kind of leads me into the next part of this, which is talking about the Patriot Act. Now, in 2008, when I got started in activism, the Patriot Act was being talked about a lot. This is a screenshot I took from the Cornell Law School, and this is from the U.S. Code, and this is the part of the U.S. Code that was modified by the Patriot Act and the definition of the term domestic terrorism. So the term domestic terrorism means activities that A, involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, or B, appear to be intended to 1. Intimidate or coerce a civilian population, 2. Influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or 3. To affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and C. Occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So, when do we cross over into domestic terrorism? Well, when we intimidate or coerce a civilian population. To give you examples of what that looks like, this would be the one that I would pull up, which would be this one right here. So, tell me if this fits the definition as far as you're concerned.
If you don't give us our shit, if you don't give us our shit, we'll shut shit down.
We're shutting the party down. Nobody's gonna touch you. We're shutting your party down. Calm down. Calm down.
Bought a pair.
Now, we're not going to talk about this guy's shoes, but we are going to talk about what you just saw in that clip, which was, to me, a fairly obvious example of attempting to, how did we put it? Intimidate or coerce a civilian population. Now, when we come to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, we could come over here to this clip here of the Sunrise Movement. They're outside a state official's house. Going after Lindsey Graham, and this is specifically about, the new, basically going there to coerce them into not trying to nominate a new Supreme Court justice. And that would definitely, I think, would fall under the category of to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. As far as to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, we have had plenty of mass destruction recently in our cities. I can't, as far as assassination, you could talk about, Michael Reinl. I did a whole video about him basically walking up and killing a Trump supporter, but, I'd say that's a bit of a stretch, but things, we're kind of heading in that direction. And then you have Kidnapping, we don't really necessarily have that in the classical sense yet, but, as far as occurring within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, we definitely have, more or less come to that. So, basically to get into, well, actually, we'll go over here first. So this is put out by the New York Times. Some protests against police brutality take a more confrontational approach. The protests are moving into white residential neighborhoods where activists demand that people choose a side. So in this article, Terrence Moses was watching protesters against police brutality march down his quiet residential street one recent evening when some in the group of a few hundred suddenly stopped and started yelling. Mr. Moses was initially not sure what the protesters were upset about, but as he got closer he saw it. His neighbors had an American flag on display. It went from a peaceful march calling out the names to all of a sudden bang. "How dare you fly the American flag?" asked Mr. Moses, who is black and runs a nonprofit in the group in Portland, Oregon area. They said, "Take it down." They wouldn't leave. They said they're going to come back and burn the house down. Mr. Moses and others blocked the demonstrators and told them to leave. We don't go around terrorizing folks to try and force them to do something that they don't want to do. Whose nonprofit group provides support for local homeless people. I'm a veteran. I'm for these liberties. Nearly 4 months after the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, some protesters against police brutality are taking a more confrontational and personal approach. The marches in Portland are increasingly moving to residential and largely white neighborhoods, where demonstrators with bullhorns shout for people to come out of your house and into the street and demonstrate their support. These more aggressive protests target ordinary people going about their lives, especially those who decline to demonstrate allegiance to the cause. That includes a diner in Washington who refused to raise her fist to show support for Black Lives Matter, or in several cities, confused drivers who happen upon the protests. But the tactics are dividing supporters of Black Lives Matter, with some worried that the confrontational approach will antagonize people who would otherwise be receptive to the message, or play into conservatives' critique of the protests, which have been largely nonviolent nationally. Others, frustrated that little has changed since Mr. Floyd is killed, say that sitting idly and watching a protest without participating nowadays is to show tacit support for racism. So now it's not enough to, even quietly support. You have to get out and do what they're doing. They said, "We don't need allies anymore. We need accomplices." In Rochester, New York, protesters have confronted people at outdoor restaurants. That's actually the video I showed you earlier. Shaking dinner tables. Yeah, they did a little more than shake them. Marchers in Washington also accosted people eating outside, urging everyone to raise their fists. The more personal tactics echo those being used against elected officials, with activists showing up not only outside of mayors' houses, but out of their homes as well. The apartment building where the mayor of Portland lives has been vandalized. Protesters lit fires outside, ignited fireworks, and broke into one of the businesses in the building on his birthday. And in San Jose, California, demonstrators graffitied and egged the mayor's house and lit an American flag in front of it. According to the police in Rochester, people have recently posted police officers' home addresses and information about their families, according to a police spokeswoman. In Portland, Jesse Burke, who is white and owns a coffee shop in the city, said the message of the movement is getting lost as the protests escalate and target ordinary residents in their homes. Everyone was looking for solutions at first, but now it's just a nightly fight that has gotten progressively more violent, and every neighborhood worries that that fight will come to their neighborhood. Mr. Burke said, "It's wake up, you need to be in the street protesting if you stand for this." The problem is that it's not really working. They think that, I think that basically they're getting people to be perhaps more quiet about it, but the strategy itself is not working. And that's the part that has to be, dealt with. And I don't think that overall, you see we have, yeah, I got to talk about this. So one night this month, there were 2 protests promoted on the Black Lives Matter Portland events page, a nonviolent protest in the city center and an autonomously organized direct action march. No one appeared to be at the city center protest, but around 200 people were at the other event. They gathered in an unlit park in a residential neighborhood around 8 p.m. Everyone wore black, including some protesters who had on body armor and motorcycle helmets. They hastily set up picnic tables and supply booths in the dark, using cell phones for light to showcase their goods. There was a food table overflowing with protein bars and Monster energy drinks. A small free literature selection was set up on the grass and overseen by the three people in ski masks. It was a popular offering, and people crowded around craning to see the pamphlets. Titles included Why Break Windows? Another one is I Want to Kill Cops Until I'm Dead. Another one is Peace Now, Peace Later, An Anarchist Introduction to Firearms. Another one is In Defense of Smashing Cameras and Three-Way Fight, Revolutionary Anti-Fascism and Armed Self-Defense. So here's another kind of incident as they're talking about what happened later on when they moved out. Neighbors in impressive craftsman-style homes pulled down their shades and turned off their lights, though many could be seen peering out the dark windows. One woman stepped out of an expansive home looking angry upon seeing the crowd. She quickly retreated indoors. A few young couples stood in their doorways. A black woman driving past honked and cheered. One white man stepped onto his patio, clapping and hollering in support of the passing march. The group called for him to join. He smiled and waved them on, still clapping. They began to chant that he was spineless. He looked worried, but the march moved along and he went back into his house. You'll never sleep tight. We do this every night, the protesters chanted. So they're going into people's neighborhoods, who otherwise probably could have supported them outside of all of this, and they're doing things up to and including, forcing and coercing people to take their American flags down and saying they're going to come back and burn their house down if they don't. So that comes back to, to intimidate or coerce the civilian population. Domestic terrorism. And, as I pointed out, people are talking about, well, what does that even mean? And so I pulled up this ACLU article, How the USA Patriot Act Redefines Domestic Terrorism. Section 802 of the USA Patriot Act expanded the definition of terrorism to cover domestic as opposed to international terrorism. A person engages in domestic terrorism if they do an act dangerous to human life that is a violation of criminal laws or state of the United States. It basically reads the definition I already did. But additionally, the acts have to occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction. Section 802 does not create a new crime of domestic terrorism. However, it does expand the type of conduct that the government can investigate when it is investigating terrorism. Now, when you're being investigated, a whole lot of provisions that you normally wouldn't have to worry about, like the wireless wiretapping and spying on you in general, come into play. The USA Patriot Act expanded the governmental powers to investigate terrorism, and some of these powers are applicable to domestic terrorism. The definition of domestic terrorism is broad enough to encompass the activities of several prominent activist campaigns and organizations. Greenpeace, Operation Rescue, Veeks Island, and the World WTO protesters and the Environmental Liberation Front have all recently engaged in activities that could subject them to being investigated as engaging in domestic terrorism. One recent example is the Veeks Island protests when many people, including several prominent Americans, participated in civil disobedience on a military installation where the United States government had been engaging in regular military exercises, which these protesters oppose. The protesters illegally entered the military base and tried to obstruct the bombing exercises. This conduct would fall within the definition of domestic terrorism because the protesters broke federal law by unlawfully entering the airbase, and their acts were for purposes of influencing a government policy or by intimidation or coercion. The act of trying to disrupt bombing exercises arguably created a danger to human life, their own and those of the military personnel. Using this hypothetical as a starting point, we will go through the USA Patriot Act and explore the new governmental powers that could be brought to bear on Veeks Island protesters. Now, the way this is relevant to what's going on in Portland and other places is that there seems to be this interesting fixation on the part of protesters to try to burn down federal buildings, and, obsession with it, really. And as soon as you get into that situation, now you're stepping into this direction. So here's the things that the Patriot Act can basically bring about on you if you engage in this. Seizure of assets. Section 806 of the Act could result in the civil seizure of their assets without a prior hearing and without them ever being convicted of a crime. It is by far the most significant change of which political organizations need to be aware. Section 806 amended the Civil Asset Forfeiture Statute to authorize the government to seize and forfeit all assets, foreign or domestic, of any individual, entity, or organization engaged in planning or perpetuating any of domestic or international terrorism against the United States or their property, and all assets, foreign or domestic, affording any person a source of influence over any such entity or organization. acquired or maintained by any person with the intent and for the purpose of supporting, planning, conducting, or concealing an act of domestic or international terrorism against the United States, citizens or residents of the United States or their property, derived from, involved in, or used or intended to be used to commit any act of domestic or international terrorism against the United States, citizens or residents of the United States or their property. So basically, the short form is, without any kind of a hearing, if it's determined that you're involved with domestic terrorism, they can seize your assets. This language is broad enough to authorize the government to seize any assets of any individuals involved in the Vikes Island protests or any organization supporting the protests of which the person is a member, or from any individuals who are supporting the protesters in any way. Possible supporters of the protesters could include student organizations that sponsored participation in the demonstration, the Rainbow Push Coalition, Reverend Sharpton's National Action Network, and religious or community organizations provided housing or food to the protesters. So this would absolutely include Black Lives Matter and or Antifa. The civil asset forfeiture power of the United States government is awesome. The government can seize and or freeze the assets on the mere assertion that there is probable cause to believe that the assets were involved in domestic terrorism. The assets are seized before a person is given a hearing and often without notice. In order to permanently forfeit the assets, the government must go before a court, but at a civil hearing, and the government is only required to prove that the assets were involved in terrorism by a preponderance of the evidence. Because it is a civil proceeding, a person is not entitled to be represented by an attorney at public expense if they cannot afford to pay for one. Basically, you're on your own. The time between seizure and forfeiture can sometimes be months. Meanwhile, organizations or individuals whose assets have been seized are forced to make do without the assets. Only the most financially flushed nonprofit organizations would be able to successfully defend themselves against government forfeiture. In short, without the full due process afforded in criminal cases, the U.S. government can bankrupt political organizations it asserts are involved in domestic terrorism. Disclosure of the education records was another aspect. They can go after like whatever you got out of the library. There's all kinds of other really spooky, like deep statey kind of stuff that's in the Patriot Act. And single jurisdiction search warrants. They can get a warrant on something, that you're doing in the state of California, even though you don't live there. That was another one of the problems about it. But so I'm going to do a better video about this topic later, but I wanted to kind of, bring people into the understanding of what what my issues really are, and that is that I feel that the left is being manipulated, into a battle that's not winnable, and that it's going to seriously damage our credibility. I showed the graph earlier about the dropping, support for Black Lives Matter that's been going on. So the people that are saying that the protests are working, or rather that the riots are working, are not really thinking clearly. I mean, you look back at that video of them going into that cafe, you think that people who experienced that basically, Nazi brown shirt activity became more supportive of Black Lives Matter after that? And people will say, well, yeah, 93% of the protests are peaceful. Okay, well, the vast majority of police interactions also don't end in anybody's death. That doesn't change the impression that people have of it. And again, whether you think it's right or not, activism is public relations. So you're trying to win people over. You're trying to change their minds. And if that's not your goal, and your goal is instead to make them afraid, get ready for a pushback that you're not going to be in a situation that you can actually deal with. I think that this is something I talked to, my friend Aaron, Storm Clouds Gathering from YouTube about, is that essentially because all of these things have been allowed to happen, because the government is definitely not fighting you back yet, that people are getting this bold idea in their head that these riots are in some way accomplishing something, when the truth is, the people in charge are biding their time and waiting for your public opinion, your public support to drop low enough to the point that people will be out in the streets cheering, not for Black Lives Matter, but because you got arrested. Because that's where they're headed already. And if they cart you off to some camp somewhere, instead of being opposed to it, which right now, we're getting to that point already where people are like, somebody needs to just round these people up and lock them up, and so the more you engage in this kind of activity, Recognize that you're essentially playing into the hands of the elite that want you to fail. It might make you feel good to scare people and push people around and destroy property, but it doesn't work. That's why Martin Luther King didn't do it, because it doesn't work. It's not just that it's immoral, it doesn't work. Thanks for tuning in. Like and subscribe and ring the bell.